Hi, patrons.
Hey y'all, what are you doing? Y'all doing good?
Can see my hair getting shaggier and shaggier over the course of
I love it.
episodes.
I think it's great. I think I would love to see like a time lapse of both of us on the show and just watch your hair get shaggy and then short and then shaggy and then short and mine just
Yeah.
gets longer and crazier and I start looking more and more and more like Alan Moore, like I'm sitting in a cave somewhere writing like, some Swamp Thing um series.
Oh, I heard his run of Swamp Thing was like the best one ever.
It's the really truly the only one you need to read. I mean, Swamp Thing is cool, but like that's the one that's like the definitive one. So it's really fascinating. I mean, Swamp Thing is such a weird thing. It's like this guy dies and then becomes part of the green, which is, the earth. But the
Yeah.
green is apparently a universal like entity that is like a life-giving plant-based thing. So he's just basically like the ultra vegan. And
Hmm.
he struggles with knowing whether or not he is himself or he is like a creature that thinks he is this other. Like the whole thing is like there's no definitive answer on like
Right.
whether Swamp Thing is the person and his consciousness was transferred into the green or if the green thinks that it is this guy. But and there's probably somebody listening like on this going like that's not Swamp Thing, Shane. Whatever. It doesn't matter. Comic books are crazy. So
Yeah. See, I heard that there's. 'Cause I sort of heard a breakdown of this on one of the podcasts I was listening to, and they more or less landed on like there's like four different ways that the story has been sort of realized with this
yes.
character. Like some of them that where it's kind of more like a reanimated corpse that's like being
Uh-huh.
run by like greenery, and some of them where it's more like it's more like sentient greenery sort of absorbed his consciousness, but it isn't really him, is more like a copy of him.
Uh-huh.
Um and like stuff like that. And so there's like this wide spectrum of like what's really clear is it's not just a guy anymore.
Yeah. What's the clearest thing is that he is just it's a green monster.
Yeah, it is
So,
a green
but
monster. What that
um
means seems
yeah.
to oscillate between hero and villain, which I mean all of them do that a lot, but
Yeah. Now
whether
he's interesting though.
yeah.
I like him. I like Swamp Thing.
Yeah, I'm very curious about some of the sort of just lore that's been I think particularly Alan Moore. I'm like I feel like I should just read every comic he ever wrote because like pretty much anytime someone talks about some run of stories, they're like the Alan Moore run. Oh my God, so good. Like, didn't he do a Batman one that was really dark?
Yeah, he did Killing Joke, I think. And
Oh, that they made a movie out of that.
Killing Joke is brutal. Like that one is really like pretty intense. And yeah, I mean there's a couple authors that like I think people like characters, but like there's a couple authors that do certain runs really well that are just worth checking out. Like Jeff Johns does a really cool run on Green Lantern
Mm.
where because Green Lantern the whole thing is like he's kind of like this like Boy Scout like Hal Jordan is like here we go and he's like he has like willpower is his thing, right?
Yeah.
But Jeff Johns like introduces like the emotional spectrum, which means that like every color on the color spectrum is linked to some emotion, and the armies and the core that go along, like the lanterns that go along with those colors, have different powers. Like the red or the rage lanterns, like the red lanterns are like powered by rage, and they vomit acid blood, which rules. Um, and they just are uncontrollable. Basically, once you get a red ring, you can't get away from having a red ring because it replaces your heartbeat and your blood. So,
Wow.
um,
That
so
really
it
sounds like
rules.
the Republican Party.
Yeah,
The rage
nailed it.
the rage party that vomits acid and can't get away from it because they've replaced their hearts with some
Yeah,
weird synthetic materialistic thing.
yep. And then the blue lanterns are powered by hope, but they only really work if they're around a green lantern, um, because without willpower, hope is meaningless, is basically what the message is there. Like without the will to do something, it doesn't matter how much you hope. So like, which is kind of fun. And like, yellow is fear, orange is avarice. I think indigo is compassion. Anyway, my point is that like some authors just know characters really well and they do a
Yeah.
really good version of them. Like Jonathan Hickman, anything you read by Jonathan Hickman is cool, but um yeah, Alan Moore is kind of the definitive like DC weirdo. And then Neil Gaiman is like just reading Sandman is the coolest. Like Sandman is
Mm.
just such a wild ride. So
I did read American Gods by him, which was a
American Gods is
really,
great.
yeah, that was a really cool book. Very thought provoking. Um, but did Alan Moore do Watchmen? Was that him?
Yes, yes, yes.
Holy shit, I loved Watchmen. So that was one of the graphic novels I've actually read. Um, I've read Kick-Ass, I've read Watchmen, I've read 300. Um, I did the first two compendiums of Walking Dead. Um, but Kick-Ass was so fucking good.
Yeah, the Kick-Ass is great. Kick-Ass is a lot of fun. The Hellboy series is really cool. Um, Deadly Class is really cool.
Oh, Mark
Um,
Millar, that's who. Yeah, he wrote the
Mark Millar
Kick-Ass.
does some cool stuff. Mark
Yeah.
Millar does some really cool. Mark Millar did this really cool it was like a just like a few issues called Nemesis. It's
Okay.
basically like if Batman were a psychopath. I mean,
Okay.
not that Batman is not a psychopath, but like
Right.
if he were instead like taking all of the Batman powers and like all of the money, but he was like a skilled assassin serial killer.
Yeah.
Um so that one was pretty good. I'm trying to think why the last man is cool. Um, Preacher is really good. I think that you would actually really like Preacher.
Oh, I think I have a couple of those. They're like sort of anime style.
No, it's that one's not. It's like really dark though. It's about oh, what happens? I think one of the archangels comes down to Earth and inhabits this body, and this preacher is like a drunk asshole that like is trying to find this archangel while all of the other while all the other like entities are going on. Yeah, that's preacher.
Oh, that's different from what I had.
Yeah.
Um,
So that one is a lot of fun though. It
I've
gets a
heard
little
of
bit
that.
wild. There's a character that shot himself in the face. He was trying to kill himself, and he survives. And they just call him at Arseface because like he's
Hmm.
just like his whole face is deformed and like turns into like a puckered butthole for a mouth
Ooh,
instead. So like it's brutal, dude. Like it's pretty dark. But Arseface is a really great character. Yeah, I mean, I think if you like, I mean, Alan Moore though is a great if you like dark weird stuff. Alan Moore, um, I would say Alan Moore and Neil Gaiman are both great comics reads.
good to know.
Yeah, and then
Um,
anything by Jonathan Hickman rules. He's just like does this really great job of tying all these really crazy fucking stories together. He did this really great run on Fantastic Four where it's called Future Foundation because Human Torch died and they just had to rebuild the Fantastic Four as like this different entity, and Spider-Man was part of it. It was really cool.
wow, that sounds cool.
Yeah, it was fun.
Yeah, I was pretty partial to X-Men when I was younger because of that TV show. And I really liked specifically Gambit on for some reason on X-Men.
Yeah,
Um, and
you should watch
then
X-Men '97. He's great in
yeah.
it.
Um, but yeah, as I tried reading a few, I think I read maybe like an issue of Punisher or something. Um, I had a hard time because so what happened was my uncle like didn't know what to get me for Christmas, and so he just gave me like an issue, like a single issue of Punisher. So it was what I didn't understand about comics is that a lot of times they were serialized in these sort of
Yes.
runs. Like it wasn't meant to be a self-contained story inside of a single issue. And so it opens and I have no idea what the fuck is going on. I don't know who any of these
Yeah.
characters are. I don't know why they're doing any of the things that they're doing. then it just ends with no conclusion whatsoever. And I was like, am I supposed to read this left to right, top to bottom? Like, how do I do this? And so, like, that confused me greatly. And I was like, I think comics are just not for me, apparently.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, that's fair. And especially with so much history and lore, like it's hard to keep up with stuff. Like it's good to get in on like the beginning of a run though, because if you get in on
right.
the beginning of a run, it'll catch you up on all the stuff. Like Jonathan
Yeah.
Hickman does a really good run on X-Men where he basically like resets the kind of the not resets, but like he basically kind of gives you a really good starting point, which is um this storyline called House of X, where like all the X-Men live on Genosha. You find out that Genosha or Krakoa, I'm sorry, Krakoa is like the place they live, where it's like the mutant haven and it's its own mutant. Like Krakoa is a mutant island that is taking care
Mm.
of them. And they have this council where like basically the mutants were like, fuck all of you, fuck humanity. Y'all have been terrible to us. We have cures for all of your diseases. We have powers that can save all of you. So if you want us to keep doing this and give you all of these things, you're going to recognize us as a sovereign nation and you're going to leave us the fuck alone. And that's how it starts. And it's like
Mm.
all of the mutants, not just the X-Men. Like there's a council that's got Apocalypse on it, Magneto on it, Professor X, Mr. Sinister, Sebastian, all the villains are there, but all the heroes are there too, and they're all it's like this council. They're like running the mutant lands. It's
Hmm.
fucking great.
Wow. Okay. Interesting.
Yeah, it's worth a read. I mean, Jonathan Hickman does really cool like time travel, like alternate timeline stuff too, which is like he's like just so smart. You're like, oh okay. Like he also wrote this book called God is Dead. This series that's called God is
Sweet.
Dead, where it's basically like all of the gods get into they start to battle. The whole story is that all of the gods from every mythology begin to battle over who is the sovereign ruler of humanity as humanity decides to stand up for themselves and creates their own gods using science, and then all of the gods die. And then like the planet is left in ruins because none of the gods are around to control the things that they were controlling.
Wow.
It's fucking wild, dude.
All right.
Yeah.
Um, okay. I'm excited to talk about harm reduction.
Oh yeah, by the way, folks, we're talking about harm reduction today.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we went for a good like 20 minutes on this already.
Yeah.
I
Uh-huh.
got
Uh-huh.
we've been going. All right,
Yeah.
cool. Well,
Surprise.
anyway, all right. So, are you ready?
I am ready.
All right, perfect. Let me make sure my levels actually look good and that I'm in fact recording on the right channel because I was not just recording on the right channel a second ago. Um,
It
okay, so
happens.
that's looking pretty good. Let's delete that nonsense there. Okay. God damn it. I fucking did it again. There. Record there. Okay, it looks good. Okay. Ready?
I'm ready.
3, 2, 1, go. Welcome to Why We Do What We Do. I am your compassionate, caring host, Abraham.
And I'm your rational solution host, Shane.
We're a psychology podcast. We talk about all the things that people and animals do, and lately we've been talking a lot about substance use and dependency, and we are continuing that theme of topics and talking about and discussing some of the things that are I think around this. So far, what we've covered is just a basic discussion about what addiction is. We've talked about the war on drugs. We've talked about Alcoholics Anonymous. We've talked about what was the other one I missed that we already talked about?
Oh no, I don't remember.
We just recorded it last week.
We did. We did Alcoholics Anonymous. We did We're on Drugs.
That's right before the disease. Oh, the disease. Okay.
Disease
Beep.
model.
We talked about the disease model of addiction, and we have more planned for this continued series of topics that we feel very strongly about. But today we're talking about specifically a strategy for supporting people with addiction called harm reduction.
Yes, and so I think this episode is going to fall in line with a little bit of the myth busting episodes that we like to do.
Yeah, I think that's
I think
fair.
there's going to be a nice flavor of that to it. But yeah, I think there's a lot of misconceptions about what harm reduction is, and or at least what people think harm reduction might be, and some
Right.
of maybe the isolated interventions that are done inside of that. And so you'll kind of see as we go through what all this means and what that looks like.
Yeah, yeah. There's kind of this ethos or orientation to thinking about the kinds of policies that should be in place around things like substances, drugs, and dependency that have been largely colored pretty much entirely by ideology and not at all backed by any amount of science or research. And so that's why this is sort of the myth busting topic, is I think we've seen a pretty failed approach to how to handle this throughout most of human history where drugs have been available and have been a concern. And so it's sort of worth taking a look at what alternatives there are and what might work a little bit better.
Right, absolutely. But before we do that, we've got some holidays to celebrate.
Yes, this episode publishes April 24th. And on April 24th, it is Administrative Professionals Day. We see you. Thank you all for your help.
Yes, thank you so much. It is Armenian Genocide Remembrance Day, so super important day. If you're not familiar with that history, please take some time to read it and review it and understand that we do not want to repeat it or continue to repeat something like this at all.
Yes, genocide bad.
Yeah, I feel like that's an easy place to stand, but apparently people have a very hard time saying that.
You're right. Yeah, it seems like there seems to be some sort of general genocidal maniacs roaming the world right now, and that's bad, I think.
Yeah, very bad.
Um, but anyway, unrelated to all of that, it is Denim Day.
Yes, it is, and it is also Help Animals Day.
It is International Guide Dog Day. That's where the animals help us.
Yeah, I love those animals that help us. It's National Skipping Day, which is really great because people forget how to skip.
Fair, fair. I think also had a cartwheel.
That's
And
true.
I don't know that that one's coming back to me. It is New Kids on the Block Day. That's fun.
Yeah, so put on your Donnie Wahlberg shirts, I guess. It's a Sauvignon Blanc Day, which I'm surprised I could even say that because I failed French terribly.
That was pretty good. It
Thanks.
is Scream Day, and this is not Scream the movie. This is not Scream like Scream out of terror. It's meant to be the Scream of catharsis, but I like to think of it as like hardcore metal music day.
Yeah, go listen to Hope Conspiracy. It's Stop Food Waste Days, which I really like that.
Yeah, World Day for Animals in Laboratories.
Yeah, big. Yeah, I don't want to say we're big fans of animals in laboratories, but I think that our field has gotten a lot out of animals in labs.
That is true.
I will
That
say.
has been a very big part of our the basic research behind our science.
I did see a great video of a rat who had these that was in like a little like RC car that would like press
Oh,
buttons to drive the RC car around to go
it's
get
adorable.
treats. It was the greatest. So I'm gonna buy a rat go-kart. Um, it is American Quitter Society Day. Big fan of that. I'm gonna join that group.
It is Animal Cruelty and Human Violence Awareness Week, which is
Yes,
important
it is.
given that some of the animals in laboratories faced a lot of cruelty.
Yeah. That's a whole thing that we'll probably unpack one day at some point. It's Bed Bug Awareness Day. So yeah. They live in your computers if you didn't know that.
Hmm. Animals we probably could be crueler to. It is
Yeah.
Cleaning for a Reason Week. The reason is because that way the things are clean.
Yeah. I mean, I don't make up a reason. Like just do it.
Yeah.
It's also National Coin Week, which coins are fascinating.
Yeah. National Infants Immunization Week. Big fan of that.
Yeah, Andrew Wakefield, not so much. It's National Organ Tissue Donor Awareness Week. So huge. I'm an organ donor.
Same.
Please do that. You don't need your organs after you die.
Yeah, I collect them and then donate them to other people. Um,
Yeah.
just kidding. um, it is also National Stop Snoring Week. I'm sure
Yeah,
many
good
people
luck
can get
with
on board
that.
with that. Yeah, good luck. Exactly. We do just like to mention those holidays, but we're not actually a podcast that talks primarily about holidays. It's just a thing that we do for fun. We're actually here to talk about the psychology of things. And the thing that we're talking the psychology about this time, as we mentioned at the top, is addiction, specifically around the topic of supporting addiction with strategies such as harm reduction. And it's important, I think, to unpack what harm reduction is. And let's actually start by getting into where we came from on this issue and the sort of the history that led to where we ended up.
Yes. So the vast majority of policies to address drug use emphasize or are solely committed to abstinence only programs. Don't you just say no? The DARE
Yep,
programs, they are explicitly
exactly.
designed to say, just don't do it.
Right.
And the thing is, as long as people have been using illicit drugs, the strategy to combat that has been to criminalize it and teach abstinence as the solution. As we talked about in the war on drugs, not working so far. But let's talk
Yeah.
about some actual data on this.
Right, yeah. The overwhelming majority of policies still to this day in most places around the world are to treat this as a moral legal issue in which people are imprisoned, and we are still having record numbers of overdose deaths happening. So according to data aggregated by the US Department of Health and Human Services, death in the United States due to overdose have been mostly increasing since 1999 up to 2021 and increasing significantly.
Yeah, I mean, I'm looking at this graph right now, and it is pretty I mean, like it's just a constant just kind of rising.
Yeah, it was like in the thousands, now up to the tens of thousands. I mean, like almost 80,000 as of 2021, up from like maybe 7,000. So huge, huge jump.
Yeah, big jump. Now, the most substantial of these and the drug most responsible for or at least attributed to overdose deaths, which was zero at the time that the data started being collected, is synthetic opioids such as fentanyl. Which represents a greater than 10,000% increase. The next highest drug is methamphetamine and a similar high abuse psychostimulants, which sees a 6,400% increase, followed by cocaine, which sees a 760% increase, then prescription opioids, which has increased by 460%, but was on a downward trend at least as of 2021 when these data were collected. And finally, heroin, which was on a rapid increase around 2012, but has actually been on a steady decrease since 2017, but still represents a 250% total increase from baseline. So across all of these major drugs, there's just a huge increase across the board, even with those declining numbers in some of those.
Yeah, and really the only one of those that was really in decline at the time that they finished aggregating these data was heroin. Pretty much everything else was continuing to increase or at least maintain relatively stable levels, which were just very, very high.
Right.
Okay, so this is a major concern for a lot of people. I mean, we're talking about a lot of lives here, and even conservative politicians tend to want to allocate money toward this problem because so many people fall victim to the scourge of dependency. I mean, and this is regardless of your faith, your politics, of your other values. We all know someone who has struggled with addiction at some point. Sometimes it's right within our inner circle. Sometimes it's just one, maybe two nodes away. From
Right.
like from a friend of a friend, out about that far is usually as far as you need to go before you have found someone who has suffered from some kind of addiction disorder or dependency at some point. And so because of the widespread nature of this, many people have a vested interest in trying to manage this in some way. And even people who generally think the government's not for that, the government's not for anything, and then they work in the government, they
Uh-huh.
are still like, all right, this is a thing that we should use the government funds to try and address.
Right. So one thing though, there is this one approach that I think is really fascinating, and that's what we're talking about today, is this idea of harm reduction. And harm reduction is a public health strategy to support people suffering from addiction by implementing risk reduction, prevention, and health support systems. Simply put, it is intended to reduce the harm that may happen from high risk behaviors and activities. High risk here specifically meaning substantial increases in the potential for serious medical complications or death. So harm reduction is designed to be a set of procedures or a set of interventions or a set of policies that are explicitly designed to reduce the adverse effects that go along with addiction and substance use and all of the things that we've been talking about.
Exactly. Yes, this is mitigating the kinds of fallout, fallout's a weird word to say that, the kinds of fallout that can happen from using substances. This is trying to avoid the worst of the worst kind of outcomes. And particularly, there's a huge focus on trying to reduce death, death by
Right.
overdose or death by spread of communicable diseases, et cetera. And we'll get into a lot of that. But there's been a lot of misunderstandings and misconceptions about harm reduction and what it does and what it's meant to do and how it's implemented. And we will get into all of that during this conversation. We're going to specifically unpack, I think, the aspects of this that are what you might consider or people would think of as being controversial, even though I think if we just look at this from a purely, I think, values based and science based direction, there's a pretty
Right.
clear like way to go on this.
Right. I mean, the primary view of harm reduction is a compassionate care approach with the primary objective to save as many lives as possible. And I think if you are looking at it from that perspective and in reducing harm, we want to save as many lives as possible by setting up a situation so that people can avoid not only just the risks of substance use, but all of the tangential kind of side effects or these other things that come out of it too, which people don't realize is actually a significant problem too. So this means that people in the harm reduction orientation have implemented strategies that sometimes appear counterintuitive or confusing at first blush, but are actually designed to specifically minimize all of the harm that comes with different types of substance use.
Exactly right. Sorry, did you finish this
I
point
didn't
here?
do the last bullet point.
Oh, did you do the counterintuitive or confusing at first
Yes,
blush?
yes, I
Oh,
did. Yes, I
sorry,
did.
I was right there. I had the
You're
idea
good.
of like doing kind of a fun mini of where we talk about the sort of the people's attempts to quantify the value of human life. I think it'll point out kind of how gross of an activity that is to begin with, but also
Yeah,
just unpack a few of them.
yeah,
Because I know there's like how much money would the average person make in their lifetime is like a version of that, and be like, this is why
yeah.
that's dumb.
Right.
All right. Okay. Beep. Before we get into some of what these strategies are, as I said, let's unpack the history a little bit. So, I think it was worth understanding what harm reduction is to start to talk about to unpack this topic. But I do want to dig into the sort of timeline here. So I think the important thing in understanding harm reduction, as we've used it here, we've been talking about drugs specifically, but most of us have been using some form of harm reduction strategies for a very long time. And I mean, it
Right.
kind of spans anything you think of as being a risky activity. People wear armor when going into battle. Battle is an inherently high risk activity, and armor reduces the likelihood that weapons will be effective against the armor wear. It reduces the harm, right? So
Right.
harm is reduced by wearing armor. And there's lots of examples like this where like there's a lot of inherently risky activities that we can try and mitigate the danger of those activities.
Wait, okay, so did you finish did you okay, all right.
I just ended right at the end of that first bullet point. I do any of the
Okay.
sub bullets here.
All right, cool. All right. So, as some examples of different types of harm reduction activities, one of the things is that sometimes we will maybe give people forewarnings before we start playing ads.
That you really caught me off guard there. That was good.
Yeah.
We are back. So you were alerted. Now we have returned. So now you can stop doing all the fast forwarding you were probably or maybe doing, or maybe not. I don't know. Maybe you like listening to ads.
Maybe you like ads.
Yeah. Anyway, we were talking about the various strategies that people have used to try and reduce harm. One of them I mentioned was wearing battle and armor, but there's also like a lot of things that I think that we do just kind of naturally anymore. Wearing sunblock, right? Wearing sunblock reduces the risk of sun cancer by exposure to a lot of sunlight. That is harm reduction, right? There is a risk of exposure to sun causing skin cancer, and we can reduce the risk of that by wearing sunblock. That's a one strategy.
Yeah, filters on cigarettes actually reduce the size and the amount of chemicals that are able to enter the lungs. Although there is some debate in the scientific community about how effective this really is at preventing lung disease. There's probably at least some argument that a filter is probably at least delays it to some degree.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, let's look at cars are a very inherently risky thing that we engage in. We're barreling down, the road at super high speeds in these small little metal boxes that crumple really easily. Um,
Yep.
and and so we have built in some harm reduction strategies. Seatbelts and airbags significantly decrease the risk of bodily injury in the event of a car crash. And there are increasingly more and more features, sensors and alarms and specific aspects of vehicles that they've started to build in that are meant to reduce harm. There's like lights on your mirrors that might or on your dash that might show up if someone's in the lane next to you, so you know not to change lanes in case they were in your blind spot or you didn't see them. There are the like backup and rear view and front facing cameras to help sort of monitor the road for debris for some cars that have those features. There are these lane assist features where if you start to drift from your lane, it'll just sort of gently pull the steering wheel back toward the center of the lane by those cameras that are watching the lines on the road. So like there's all
Yeah.
kinds of these things that have started to reduce the danger that is built into operating something like a vehicle.
Yeah. Which is just fantastic. Just thinking about like when I was a kid, wearing a seatbelt wasn't even required.
Right.
Like, and that was just to be clear, that was like in the 90s. That was a
Yeah.
new thing in the 90s that they were like, we should probably make people do this.
Kind of surprised actually that Florida does have that law, but I guess at this point, is that a federal law now? I'm not sure.
I don't know, but I mean, I think that something that people don't know about Florida is that we do have the yeehaw clause in all of our laws, which means that we can just do whatever we want. It's kind of a Wild West type of thing, but
Hmm.
every single law, it's like, okay, well, you could wear a seatbelt, but if you invoke the yeehaw clause, then you don't have to do anything, you know?
Oof.
So
Okay, that's
anyway,
fine.
earplugs. So earplugs reduce the risk of hearing loss when exposed to loud sounds. As musicians, I am a huge fan of earplugs. I wish I would have worn them earlier.
Same. The living with tinnitus is not my favorite thing in the world. Um,
Nope.
Sunglasses reduce the damage to our eyes from bright, consistent ambient sunlight exposure. It can help prolong the longevity of the functionality of our eyes. So that's a harm reduction strategy.
Yeah, for those of us who like to go take a dip in the ocean on a weekly basis, especially swimming with sharks, being in a shark cage will actually prevent the sharks from eating you while you are doing this. So it's just kind of a regular activity that all of our listeners engage in. So, just make sure that you've got that sturdy cage so that that shark can't bite you.
Yeah. Condoms are extremely effective at reducing the risk of sexually transmitted diseases or infections and unwanted pregnancies. So again, reduction in harm there. And so again, like these are some examples of the fact that harm reduction, broadly speaking, is something that we have mostly taken on in various circles of policy and products and capitalism. And in so many places, we have engaged in harm reduction strategies and campaigns to try and get people to try and promote a general attitude of I'm going to do a risky thing anyway. This
Right.
way, I make that thing less dangerous to me. And like living, it comes with inherent risks, but like we have as humans engineered our way through those risks. I mean, honestly, just washing your hands with soap is like a fairly new invention that was a
Yeah.
huge game changer for humans in
Yeah.
reducing disease and illness. Like that was a harm reduction strategy that has saved so many lives.
Oh my God, what a wild thing to think about. The hand washing is like the life-saving thing. There's a really great study in, I believe it was the 60s or 70s. It might have been the same, it could have been the 80s, but there was a study that they had looked at the effect of a free condom dispenser inside of a drug rehab clinic to help reduce STIs and unwanted pregnancies inside of like a cocaine treatment center.
Mhm.
And it was effective in reducing all of the things, like just having free condoms available for people. And you might be going, they shouldn't be having sex. They should be focusing on their rehab. Well, they were going to do it anyway. So at least they were doing it safely and not hurting each other, you know?
Yeah, exactly. And that is what this all comes down to. It's sort of like you could lock someone in a cage where they don't ever get exposure to sunlight. They only get the food that is the most nutritious for them. They aren't allowed to use any substances or expose their eyes or body to anything that could be potentially harmful, and ensure that they engage in a rigorous and sustainable amount of exercise to promote their optimum overall health. And if that is you, that's the way you would like your life to be lived, where someone else controls all of your decisions and you don't get to go anywhere or do anything other than the things that are immediately going to ensure you have the highest amount of health, then please let us know, because I don't think that that person exists. And so we
Right.
understand that like there is a high motivation to engage with this world, and we are trying to just reduce how dangerous that can be. And we don't need to like transform everything into an urban area to do it. All we need is some basic strategies to reduce how much harm it could be brought to us by doing things that carry with them some amount of inherent risk.
Right. So, as this, all this that we're talking about, harm reduction strategies as it relates to addiction, harm reduction strategies actually look like the kinds that, in everything that we've kind of talked about here, what we know of harm reduction strategies started to kind of begin in the 1960s. The Vietnam War was still raging between the US and Vietnam. Lead exposure was still on a massive increase, and the hippie movement was in full swing. Heroin was rapidly becoming the drug of choice among hippies, military service members, and a wide spectrum inside of and around those groups. So there was a lot of spread around that drug. Actually, it was really heroin was one of the biggest problems in like the early punk scene too, and a lot of like famous
Right.
musicians, famous punk musicians, died from heroin overdoses well before they kind of got their due and whatnot. Correspondingly, though, drug overdose deaths were suddenly directly in the face of ignorant conservative American populace. So you started to see kind of that became like the big scary problem, and then we started seeing this abstinence stuff kind of pop up.
Yeah, I mean, essentially, it was hard to alcohol addiction, I think, was well known and understood and had been around for a long time, and a lot of people had dealt with it. Different types of drugs like heroin or really any other kind of illicit, what would be considered illegal in those cases, substances, most people weren't around it and it was fairly infrequent. All of a sudden, it was like everywhere. Everyone knew someone. And I meant, and in this case, we mean ignorant as in just naive, like they just
Yeah.
they kind of weren't exposed to it. So in response to this massive increase in deaths due to heroin, one form of support to reduce the public health crisis of heroin overdose deaths was to provide a safer alternative of that drug. And so people with heroin dependency could receive free access to methadone, and they had set up these methadone clinics as a functional replacement for heroin. And people could go to these clinics and receive this to try and avoid using heroin, to which they now had a physical and often emotional dependency. And this successfully reduced not only overdose deaths, but also drug related crimes that were associated with heroin. So by the 1970s, this was a widely federally funded campaign that had bipartisan support until Ronald Reagan.
Yeah, of course. So, but this episode is not about Ronald Reagan or the failed conservative ideology that needlessly killed so many people and basically disbanded the methadone maintenance plan. Because this wasn't even called harm reduction at this point in time. So we're still kind of like this is proto harm reduction at this point.
Yes. However, related to heroin, but still loosely to Reagan in a way, the 1980s were characterized by another emerging crippling public health crisis, and this is the HIV/AIDS epidemic that started to. Well, that's when it's got its name. Like it had been around before this, but nowhere near the levels that we saw in the 80s, and didn't actually have a medical term associated with it. Initially, people was trying to figure out what it was, and then they realized it was this immune system disease, and that's why it was called HIV.
Right. So the HIV/AIDS disease started ravaging the planet in the late 70s, 1970s specifically, and it wasn't officially recognized until for what it was until about the 1980s, when it was also kind of in full swing and had a devastatingly wide and long path of bodies behind it. And so once again, the disease didn't really care who you were; it could come for anyone, but its primary means of transmission were unprotected sex and needle sharing. So a lot of kind of bodily fluid transmissions, but specifically those spaces.
But it was fairly it was pretty communicable. Like it was pretty easy to get
Yeah.
if you did have some kind of bodily fluid exchange. And of course, this is not unique to the United States. This is a worldwide issue that HIV/AIDS spread around, and countries around the world were scrambling to figure out what to do about this disease that seemed to pop up out of nowhere. Was aggressively fatal and highly contagious.
Right. So medical professionals really didn't know much about the disease at all, but they were starting to understand how it spread at least. So in the Netherlands, scientists proposed and implemented a surprising strategy to try to combat the spread of hepatitis B and C, overdose deaths, and later HIV and AIDS, all primarily due to heroin use and needle sharing. And that strategy was give the users clean needles. So I want
Yeah,
everybody to stop for a second and think about that because I think this is the part where people go, "What?"
right.
So remember that what we're talking about, things like hepatitis B and C, overdose, HIV, AIDS, all of these are, we've kind of already talked about the idea that these are issues of bodily fluids, specifically bloodborne pathogen type of situations, right? So
Yeah.
to prevent that from happening, if you give people clean needles, we can reduce that. But let's talk, we got to unpack that a little bit more. We can't just be like, just give people needles. Let's unpack what that means.
Right. Yeah, but exactly as you said, like this is the thing that I think caught people off guard, but the scientists are the people who are sort of paid to sit and think about these things, and they
Uh-huh.
correctly reasoned that people were going to use the drug one way or another, right? If they didn't have access to clean needles, they'd simply share the needle that they were already using and possibly keep the same needle to use again later, right? They were going to do that drug whether or not they had access to needles. They would just keep using the same needle, or they'd share
Right.
needles that they found that other people did have access to. So the scientists proposed, okay, let's ensure that they have access to clean needles. That way, we can at least reduce the transmission of these diseases that we're seeing, with hepatitis specifically, and also later HIV/AIDS. And they called their program harm reduction.
Right. And so I you may still be having kind of that thought that like this feels like enabling and stuff like that. Please stay with us because I think that there is a convincing argument for why this is the better approach than abstinence training and all the stuff that we've been talking about before. So this program, this harm reduction program, also had mental health and welfare programs to support people with addiction, and it was likely this combination of strategies that helped significantly reduce the spread of HIV/AIDS and hepatitis and rate of crime, and had the surprising effect of actually reducing how many people chose to use the drugs at all. So, not only, just to be clear, not only did it reduce this communicable disease and crime, it also reduced the use of the drug in general.
Right?
Huh.
Yeah,
Weird.
it does. It seems counterintuitive. It seems surprising. It seems like you'd hear that and be like, "There's no way that that is true." But that is what happened. Like it reduced those things. Now, recognizing the benefits of this program, the United States adopted a similar needle exchange program and, of course, saw the exact same benefits. It works. Like, this is a strategy that works. But it was also highly criticized by politicians. Now, not criticized by scientists or public health officials, but by
Sure.
politicians who saw drug use more of an issue of, they saw it more as an issue of morality, and specifically one that is best addressed and maybe only addressable in their mind by punishing users, by imprisoning them, by charging them fines, by arresting them, by condemning them, by telling them stop it. Like
Right.
that is the solution. Like, why didn't we try that when people tried to go to war with us? We just point at them and say stop it. No.
Enough.
Yeah, we've had it. No. Like that, just telling people to stop it does not work.
Right. To give any sort of grace on this, like the most grace I could give is that in the 1970s, maybe they just didn't have enough data to say this is an effective treatment. I mean, there was, don't get me wrong, there was. But
Yeah.
now we are 50 years on, and we have demonstrated time and time and time and time again that A, the war on drugs didn't work. Go listen to the episode on the war on drugs. And B, harm reduction does work. So at this point in time, it's willful ignorance. But we'll unpack all of that as we go. We'll unpack all of that.
Yeah, and willful ignorance also in the form of ads.
Oh, oh, I wasn't ready for that.
Beep. Okay, so we've been talking about, I think, the history, the timeline, and unpacking just what harm reduction sort of is conceptually. So let's actually go through and talk about the specific strategies used in harm reduction. And there are a lot. So we're not going to try and go through all of them here. We're going to hit the main themes, the ones that come up the most often, and I think are the most critical for the keys to success, and mostly try and give like an overarching, this is what happens in the harm reduction sphere, if you will. So let's start by just unpacking sort of what strategies exist inside of harm reduction and why.
Yeah, so these strategies that are used in harm reduction approaches are specifically designed to save lives and reduce the spread of disease. So I think those are two incredibly valuable goals when it comes to any sort of program that has to do with social services, human services, and people in general, right? Save
Right.
lives, stop the spread of disease. Everybody benefits from that. These strategies inside of harm reduction, though, include needle exchange, which we talked about. And what happens is people who use injection-based drugs can bring their used needles and receive sterilized, sharp, clean needles for free with no judgment. This doesn't mean that you're trading needles with your friend who's also a user. You're going in and
Right.
you're getting clean kits, is what they'll say. And
Yep.
the administrators at these locations also give advice for safe needle use and disposal of used syringes. So not only do you get a clean kit, but you get some coaching on how to stay safe, how to make sure you stay clean, how to prevent the diseases, and how to get rid of needles so that nobody else contracts a disease as well.
Right. And users can access all kinds of clean drug administration equipment that might otherwise be contaminated. They'll also have materials sometimes for how to smoke something that you were trying to smoke that is again clean and not riddled with, it's not been shared, doesn't have diseases. They'll have various bandages and like cotton swabs and sterilization equipment and band-aids and all kinds of things. So like people can, in the various ways that they might be trying to administer drugs to themselves, those ways can be done in a cleaner, more sanitary way in these facilities.
Right. So another thing that is part of this program is that users can also have access to a safe drug use space, which they can actively use their substance of choice in privacy while being monitored by supervising medical personnel to prevent complications or overdoses. And so these kind of look like doctors' offices. You can go in and have like a room where you're being monitored, and some of them are very plain. They have practical furniture pieces, lots of cleaning and sterilization chemicals, and a bunch of basic medical and emergency resuscitation equipment in the event that you overdose. I mean, a lot of times, a lot of drugs that are used, and one of the things that happen with overdoses is respiratory suppression. So you end up in this space where somebody can literally not breathe because of they have too much of this drug in their system, and so there's equipment that's in place to prevent that from happening. So, and again, you might be going, well, isn't that just enabling? Well, let's have a conversation about this. All right. We already know that this is reducing harm and reducing disease and reducing use. So now we're saving lives and we're keeping it in a space where HIV and AIDS is not spreading due to intravenous drug use.
Yeah, and we will talk more about the sort of enabling side of the argument when we get
Oh,
to
yes, we
the sort
will.
of myths and misconceptions aspect of this discussion. Another strategy inside of harm reduction in some of these designated spaces is that they will actually check drugs for dangerous chemicals and contaminants to ensure their safety. And note that drug checking is specifically used here and not drug testing, which is when people are tested for having used drugs, like at a job. And so a
Right.
lot of places will try and specifically call themselves drug checkers and not drug testers. So, like for example, urine tests at work would be a drug test. Um, so what they'll do is there's all these several these there's lots of different strategies for drug testing that exist. The more expensive and longer laboratory ones, they take a long time to give a return, but they have these ones that can basically give you instantaneous information that are pretty good and they're very inexpensive. And they'll use like
Right.
these little test strips that can quickly determine if some sample of drugs contain harmful chemicals like fentanyl or xylazine, which is a veterinary drug, or if they contain other drugs like hey, is there meth in my heroin? I'm trying to do heroin. I'm not trying to also do meth, right?
Right.
And so they can test them and see what else is in there. And they just need a small sample, just a little bit, and they can quickly determine, like, from the things that they have available tests for, what contaminants might be in there that are particularly dangerous.
Right, and these drug tests, drug checking practices are not solely in medical facilities. In
Yeah.
some countries where you might go to like a large festival where you might find party drugs or drug use is kind of expected, they might have drug checking tents where you can go in and
Yep.
get your whatever you've got. Like if somebody gives you something, so you can prevent the overuse or whatever it is, you can go in and check. Like, hey, what is this? Oh yeah, no, that's definitely LSD. You're good. Go have fun, be careful, like that kind of thing. So like they have it set up to kind of prevent the overuse and kind of those types of problems that happen at festivals as well.
They might have something like that at Burning Man. I didn't check to see, but I'd be willing to bet that they do.
I wouldn't be surprised if they did.
Yeah.
Um, Now, finally, as with methadone, users can receive chemical replacements to help reduce the pain of withdrawal and the need for their substance with a functional alternative. So, there are opportunities for methadone style spaces beyond just kind of what we understood in the 70s and 80s.
Yeah, and we'll talk a little bit more about some of those specifically here in a minute. Versions of harm reduction exist in many parts of the world, including parts of the United States. Most of the places that harm reduction policies are in place, there is more to it than simply ensuring that people have access to clean materials and medical staff. That is a feature, and it is, I think, a critical feature. But most of them, they take sort of a multi-pronged approach to trying to build a comprehensive strategy to understand drug use, addiction, and trying to reduce harm, with I think, an additional goal, as we'll get to, of reducing use as well in many cases.
Exactly. So let's just use Australia as an example, which maybe you don't think of Australia as the example for things sometimes. But actually Australia is pretty rad. So
Yeah,
they
they do.
specifically use
Right.
three pillar. Yeah, they do fun stuff. I mean, we've got the imports of Hugh Jackman, so we get Wolverine because of Australia. So I think we need to give Australia a little bit more credit. We get koalas, which are a blast, even though they carry leprosy and they scare the hell out of everyone because of what they sound like. But they're
They've done a
cool.
pretty good job with many of their policies, I think, over in Australia, that have had a really huge net benefit, that would maybe be worth unpacking at some time, at some point in the
Yeah,
future.
we're just gonna do a whole episode on Australia. I love it. I can't wait. We'll do a whole suite. We'll do addictions. We'll give it a little break. We'll do some fun stuff in there, and then we'll do Australia. It'll be great. Um, but yeah, why we do what we do does Australia. So Australia specifically uses this the three pillars of harm reduction. They do this by considering the drugs, the individual, and the environment. So you've got the substance, the person, and the context in which they're doing it. They strategically consider that the information given must be simple and factually correct. I love that they're not just spreading misinformation or scare tactics, as
Right?
was done during the war on drugs. They're doing the polar opposite of that, which is
Right.
probably, I wonder if that's a hemisphere thing. Like,
Is the maybe.
so, so they don't just announce this information, but they target their information to people that need to hear it. So not only are they disseminating this information, but they're specifically targeting who gets the information and who needs that information to increase the effectiveness of that harm reduction program.
Yeah, I think it's both cost effective and more, I think, reasonable to assume that, like, where you want to go spread informational campaigns about strategies around understanding and making choices around drug use are places where people are already using drugs. Like, there's no point to go to a
Yeah.
kindergarten and, like, start spouting this, or honestly, even
Yeah.
like a high school, unless you know there's like a huge amount of drug use in that high school. Like, you
Hmm.
probably want to go find the specific communities and areas where people are actually doing this and administer your information there. It's just a more filtered approach where you don't even have to spend as much time and energy and have more impact. So, like, duh. Um,
Right.
Yeah. So one of the considerations as part of the three pillars is considering the drug. And when they talk about considering the drug here, it means that they are giving education with respect to and considering with their policies mode of ingestion. So needles, pills, smoking, etc. And how frequently the drug is consumed and at what dose and what the drug does. And so specifically with those considerations to reduce harm, they may educate users on understanding how the drug works in their body. They may suggest or provide alternative, safer ways to consume the drug. So, for example, if people were ingesting it via needle, but they could instead take pills, that's a much less dangerous way to ingest that drug. They might have teach them about that, and they'll also teach them what signs of overdose are. So, their one pillar here is considering the drug, and then they focus their harm reduction campaign around the understandings and considerations of that drug.
Right. And then the second pillar is this considering the person, which means providing education to that person regarding how they can mitigate the likelihood of overdose, such as staying hydrated and eating before using, the interaction between illicit and prescribed drugs that they may also be taking because they may be on some other drugs that are prescribed and known. So it's important to understand that and help them consider their body weight when evaluating their dose. So when they're starting to look at reducing overdoses, for example, the part of the reason for overdoses is because somebody is using too much for their actual body. So
Right.
looking at this is probably a safer dose, or this is the dose range that you should look at if you're going to do this.
Yes. And then the final pillar is considering the environment. And this means educating users on strategies such as using a safe space where they can use their drug, make sure that they've got a place that they can go, making sure that they're around trusted people and not strangers or people who might be trying to take advantage of them, ensuring that they arrange transportation after they've used their drug so that they are not trying to drive themselves around or walk like ridiculous distances or through dangerous terrains or territories, and then using known and trusted dealers to obtain their drugs. So there's just
Right.
sort of these other environmental aspects of drug use meant to try and reduce the likelihood that they're going to end up in a dangerous situation that could be deadly.
Right. And I think all of those things are good general. I mean, when you kind of look at this as like a harm reduction thing, if you even if you took like let's say like illicit illegal drugs out of that for the environment one, wouldn't it be good to just do that for like, I don't know, alcohol? So you go,
Sure.
okay, so you're using it in a safe space around trusted people, arrange transportation, and only get it from people that you know, right? Pay
Makes
attention, like
sense.
that's it makes sense. So like you're already probably doing this thing or like even like thinking about the we know what the drug does or the alcohol does. So as an example, like maybe you don't drink a certain type of liquor because
Right.
it makes you mean or it makes you party. You might be one of those people. So you're kind of already considering the drug and an alternative, mocktails and stuff, which are delicious. Like you're looking at
Yeah.
the person, how much you should drink, making sure that you eat before, liquor before beer, you're in the clear. That whole like all of that is the same type of the three pillars that you're doing when you're going out to party on a Friday night. So just you're not it's not much different. You're already doing it with alcohol, but it's what more widely accepted with alcohol because it's a legal drug here in the United States. So just some stuff to
Right.
think about as we're doing this. Now, harm reduction should include multiple components. First, destigmatizing drug use and addiction, which we've kind of talked about. I mean, that's part of the reason why we are even doing this suite of episodes anyway, is to help destigmatize this, but also
Right.
destigmatizing drug use and addiction for the people who are using, because there's so much shame that goes into that, which means that people will often avoid getting resources because they're so shamed and so ashamed of what they're doing.
Right. Yeah. Um, sorry, you didn't do the second one, right?
I didn't do the second one though.
Okay. Beep. Another aspect of this, which we've talked about, but just I think this is sort of like the summary of understanding harm reduction strategies, is that because we have this destigmatizing thing, we also have safe drug spaces, needle exchange, drug checking programs with professional, kind staff, and then ensuring that the infrastructure built around these and like promotes participation in those services. So for example, someone's not going to go to a safe drug use space if they have to like schedule 3 weeks in advance, and if they're 5 minutes
Right.
late they can't go. Like they need to ensure that they allow walk-ins. They've got flexible times. They've got as low a barrier to entry as humanly possible. Like if it's something where someone has to go in and pay them $50 to use that space, those people probably aren't going to make that choice. So they need to be free
Right.
or as close to free as they can make it. And so like everything that would prevent something to get in, they want to try and clear those hurdles. But that's an aspect of the harm reduction strategy here, is to just have safety built in to the use side of drugs, or
Right.
substances of any kind. So it's like setting aside any other decisions or ideas about what should be going on. The fact is, we're now at the point where someone's using. Now that we're there, and there's nothing that we can safely do about that, because if we try to stop them, they are going to no longer come to us voluntarily. So we're already at the
Right.
point that they're using. Now, how do we make that safer for them and for the people
Yeah.
around them, honestly?
Yeah, and I think, you've heard us say the word safety a few times, and I think from a physical standpoint, that's very clear, right? Physical safety for this. But we're
Yeah,
also talking about psychological and emotional safety too, because a
totally.
lot of times we're talking about people who are using to avoid psychological distress. We are talking about the shame that goes along with this sometimes, the stigmatization that goes along with it. We are talking about safety in all regards. And if you are
Right,
creating a space where if folks are feeling safe, they are more likely to receive education that you give them. They are more likely to be safer in what they do. They are less likely to harm somebody else in that space. So you're creating a space to actively avoid not only just the harm that this person will endure if they're doing it somewhere else, but the harm that they could cause other people intentionally or not
right,
through what they're
exactly.
doing.
Very much so,
So,
yeah.
oh
Casts a
man,
wide
I
net.
love harm reduction. Okay, so some other critical features: educational programs that specifically focus on safe drug use strategies, how to recognize signs of overdose, and overdose response strategies. We also talked about mental health counseling and psychological support programs that specifically emphasize reducing motivation for drug use and decreasing drug use. So, this is a part of this that doesn't get talked about often. People are like,
Right.
oh, you're giving out free kits. But part of those programs include safe mental health services to help work on why the substance abuse or the substance disorder actually began to begin with. So you're getting services to help support working out of that space too.
And then I think just generally having some basic welfare programs and other related supports, particularly thinking about places where drugs tend to thrive, where there is very weak and poor infrastructure, where they've got relatively little oversight, where there are people who have very little money and very few resources. They may not even have access to clean drinking water, or not have they might not be able to get to a grocery store to get fresh food. Like these are places where the motivation is higher and drugs can move more easily. And so programs that support people either making those spaces safer for themselves, or like building up those spaces so that they're safe for those people, or giving them the resources so that they have access to the kinds of things that they need so they don't have to turn to any other alternatives, means that uh, and also considering like part of this includes things like medical care, like when people who are in pain and they can't afford to go to the doctor because they don't have insurance or whatever. Like these are all things where some of these programs help mitigate the motivations that exist, and also help people just make more intentional decisions rather than sort of scrambling and sort of trying to just tread water to survive all the time, which is what happens in a lot of
Right.
these spaces.
Right. Because I'm going to tell you right now, this is something that happened in Florida not even a long time ago, several years ago, under Rick Scott, is this movement to drug test anybody who was receiving welfare. And I'm going to tell you that that has never in the history of humanity worked. That is just punish people who are already struggling, to drug test them, to put them to take away their welfare, essentially saying like, oh, if you're on drugs, you don't get welfare. That is the opposite of helpful.
Right. Yeah, then like more likely to use drugs.
Yeah, exactly. Ugh, so
So
frustrating.
anyway, since we had to drop the name of Rick Scott, it's worth having a palate cleanser and just stepping away. You could hear that and be like, all right, I heard Rick Scott's name, I'm out. And I do understand that. So let's just take a quick break for the ads and we'll come back to some more wholesome discussion.
Perfect. I love that. Let me do the segue back in.
Okay.
Now that I'm done dry heaving after having said the name that should not be mentioned, I think it's worth I think taking some time to look at the research, because you might be listening to this and going, well, Shane and Abraham, this sounds like a values based thing. This sounds like a moral opinion type of thing, blah, 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 blah. But let's
Yeah.
actually like unpack the research part of this and talk about some of the ways that we have shown and demonstrated effectiveness as parts of this harm reduction type of programming.
Yes, exactly. Because yeah, you hear it and you're like, oh, these liberals always talking about this, like in their big ideology thing, and they're not considering things practically. Well, it was actually funny in preparation for this. We started getting talking about this, and I prepared the notes for this, and Shane looked at the list of references, and he's like, that's a lot of articles. And I said, yes, there were approximately
Yes.
450 quadrillion articles that had been published on this. The
Yeah.
research on this is deep.
Uh-huh.
So
Yeah.
it goes
It's
so far.
huge.
So let's give a quick. Some of these are going to be more like synthesizing a bunch of data down into a single piece of information, and some of them will reference specific studies. And the first one I'm going to talk about from the research is a drug called naloxone, and Narcan is in the same sort of
Yeah.
group of these. So if you've heard of Narcan or naloxone, they're very similar. So naloxone is a drug that binds to opioids and blocks further absorption of those opioids. And basically, the way that this works when administered is it very quickly reverses the effects of an overdose if one is like sort of in progress. There's too much in a system. And so some research has shown that like as little as just 100 naloxone kits, coupled with some education on how to use those kits among opioid users, reduced overdose deaths by 42%. There was just 100 kits in a population of over 100,000 people that were known opioid users, reduced deaths by 42%. So they didn't even have enough kits for everyone there. And they had that big of a reduction in overdoses.
I mean, I think it's really important as we're talking about like what an overdose is. An overdose is for the most part, most people are accidentally overdose. Like
Right.
nobody who is like a drug user is like going and going like, at least for the most part, it's not going and going. This will be the last time. So I think it's kind of important to unpack that too. As we go through this. All right. So buprenorphine, did I say that right?
You did. That was great.
Oh, good. Look at, hey, I did it. I am terrible with drug names. I have struggled with that for years. So I'm so glad that I did that in one try. I also
You're
read
like
that 100 times in my
marijuana.
head. I read that 100 times while you were doing that last bullet point, so I have no idea what you said. Um, all right, so buprenorphine is
That's pretty good.
a long-acting opioid replacement drug that can be substituted for the fast-acting opioids most users start with and are accustomed to. So research is emerging, but one strategy called the Bernese method involves taking tiny doses of buprenorphine while maintaining the same level of opioid drug use and slowly decreasing the
Nope.
dose
Sorry.
of the buprenorphine.
Increasing the dose of
I'm sorry. Uh,
there, and I put does.
no worries. And slowly increasing the dose of the buprenorphine. Once the user reaches a therapeutic dose of buprenorphine, they start using their original opioid substance and can more easily reduce the need
Stop
for
using.
buprenorphine. Stop using. Okay. I'm I'm all over the place. Okay, so they they stop using their original opioid substance and can more easily reduce the need for buprenorphine. And the current data suggests that this has been effective at allowing people to discontinue drug use with basically no withdrawal symptoms. Because
Right.
that's one of the biggest barriers to getting off of a substance is that your body is physically like dependent on it. So the
Yeah.
withdrawal symptoms are painful if not deadly.
Yeah, so it's basically a functional replacement that doesn't have the same like immediate high, but it prevents you from experiencing the kind of pain and discomfort that would come from withdrawal. And so
Yeah.
people who are trying to specifically quit a drug can do so more easily if they're not faced with the consequences that can sometimes come with a rapid shift in like what kind of substances are in your system.
Right.
Now, a comprehensive analysis conducted by the United States CDC on the existing research on syringe service programs, sometimes called, I think I saw SSP for syringe service programs, and then, oh, there was another one. It was like no, needle service programs, NSP, something like that. Anyway, they concluded that not only do needle exchange programs not increase crime and drug use. So there's the people who are saying like you give people needles, they're going to do a lot of drugs, and then there's going to be all this increase in crime. Not only do needle exchanges not increase crime or drug use, but users were 3 times more likely to reduce their drug use or stop altogether when in these needle exchange programs, and crime decreased as well.
I mean, it's but it's data and people don't like data, I guess. Now, a 2013 study found that simply providing a drop-in center, which is a safe drug use space, significantly decreased crime. 82% of drug users committed crime versus only 21% when the safe space was provided. So, just to be clear, having a drop-in center, which is a space that people can safely use drugs, significantly reduced crime by a little over 60%.
Yeah. Yeah. It was, I mean, huge. I mean, if you took out like 80, basically they had a group of people who didn't have access to it and a group of people who did. And it was like 82% of the people who didn't have access to it engaged in crime and only 21%. So I was like, honestly, if you took that out of the total, it's like a 75% reduction in the rate of crime,
Yeah,
depending on
yeah,
how you choose to slice up that math. But it was really substantial. So seems like a pretty worthwhile investment. Speaking
right?
of investments, one of the things I was curious about is like, what's the return on investment in programs like this? So, one study did an analysis where they specifically looked at the cost of healthcare treatment and other issues related to funding for people with HIV/AIDS. And with a budget of only $500,000, they found that if you prevented just 3 new HIV cases, that would be a cost saving measure. Just 3. All they have to do is successfully prevent 3 cases of HIV, and the $500,000 would have already paid for itself and how much
Right.
cost it saved. But not only does it prevent more than 3, these programs decreased HIV cases by 54% and hepatitis C cases by 55%. So there was a huge precipitous drop off. So the return on investment happens pretty much immediately and then just continues going on. Like you just save more and more and more and more money as the program goes on.
Right. Speaking of saving money, about $4,700 is saved per 100 injection drug users through these programs. So
Yeah,
per
needle exchange
100
specifically.
people, yeah, needle exchange program specifically. So you're finding that like just having a needle exchange program saves thousands of dollars, hundreds of thousands of dollars over time. Like
Yeah.
the amount of money that is saved through this, and also not just money, because I think a lot of people speak in money, but it's not just money, but it's like the amount of stress and the amount of grief and the amount of crime and the amount of all the things, all the tangential things that go along with like folks who struggle with addiction. All of those things are also significantly reduced. And it tends to lead to a better quality of life for literally everybody involved.
Yes. So I we've got so we got to finally got to the myth busting part here, and then I think sort of our big conclusions that I'm excited to talk about. But I always love busting a myth because I think misunderstandings are just one of these things that perpetuate poor policies that don't work and are often counterproductive. And so many believe, or at least argue, that this harm reduction approach, um, that it doesn't also include an orientation toward sort of abstinence or reduced drug use. Most harm reduction strategies actually do include a component of education with an end goal of decreasing substance use. Like that is
Right.
often a component, at least decreasing, if not quitting altogether. But again, it's not done through stigmatization, criminalization, and like making people feel bad, or using something like telling them that you don't have control or you just need to have faith. Like those things don't work, but they will do counseling, mental health, and other support strategies with the eventually there it is better for those people not to be using drugs, and everyone agrees, including the users, right? And
Right.
so and so the main objective is to prevent death. But other objectives include decreasing the spread of disease, decreasing crime, and decreasing the use of drugs altogether. So like there those goals and orientations are built into it. And I think there's a fundamental misunderstanding that people have that harm reduction is like, oh, we'll just We'll hand out free drugs to everyone. We'll show them how to use them. It'll be great. Everyone will be high all the time. That's just not what it is, right?
Not
Like
even
the point
close.
is that we actually want to decrease drug use. And we have found that some of these strategies, like the needle exchange, one does specifically do that. And that we want to have educational programs that also are oriented to a reduce in drug use, just not through the sort of shame and self-flagellating that I think is common in other programs.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Now, harm reduction strategies such as drug checking and needle exchanges are enabling drug use. That is the meth that we hear all the time. Okay, so you're checking drugs so people can use them, or giving people clean kits is just going to perpetuate that issue. And so far, we have demonstrated that that's not even close to true. Our studies have shown that that is not even close to true. If that were true, then the implication is that people who are using drugs would have decided not to use drugs, but because this needle exchange program was available, they decided, nah, I'm going to use drugs more often, especially because the needles are available. It doesn't make any sense. People are using drugs as is. So if you're providing a space, and we've already demonstrated and shown in the studies, a clean kit helps reduce HIV, helps reduce hepatitis, helps reduce all these things. And it's not, I think the other thing too is people misunderstand that needle exchange programs are just, okay, give me your dirty needles and I'll give you clean needles. That's not what it
Right.
is. There's education, there's support around this, there's all kinds of things that happen. It's so frustrating that people just cannot wrap their heads around the fact that not only is this is an active ingredient in keeping people safe.
Right.
Like this is truly showing that.
And again, like I think you have to think like, okay, so you've set up a safe space for them to do drugs, and they're like, we're just enabling them doing drugs. I'm like, okay, so you think that they would have chosen not to do drugs, but then they saw the safe space and they're like, never mind, I'm all in now. I'm like, no,
Right.
they were gonna go do drugs anyway. Like
Right.
what happened is we made it less dangerous for them, right? Or again, as you said, they're like the like, oh well, I wasn't gonna do heroin, but now that you've got a needle, I certainly will. And I mean, the other implication is thinking like, for you people saying that, you're sort of implying that that's true for you. You're like, I would be out there using drugs, but I'm afraid of dirty needles. So I'm like, if
Right.
I make clean needles available to you, you're just gonna start using heroin all of a sudden? No, nobody's doing that. I'm like,
Right.
the barrier to entry here was not safety. It was not cleanliness. Like people were going to use drugs regardless of how safe we made it for them. And so
Right.
understanding that the motivations are there, the availability is there, like we can't do anything about it at this point. Let's try and reduce how bad the damage could possibly be. And it just doesn't make any logical sense or through even the most childish understanding of how behavior works up through the most comprehensive. Like you just can't even logic your way to that being the reasonable argument, because again it assumes that like the thing that people like the people were deciding not to use drugs until we made them available. What the fuck, has that ever been the case? Like
That's
no,
never been the case.
that has never stopped someone like making. If people are like, oh, we need to crack down and make it more penalties and more crimes, I'm like, the policy has pretty much, oh, as long as there's been policies around this, the policy has been to criminalize and imprison people. And what has that gotten us so far? Surging rates of overdose deaths, huge prison populations. People are doing drugs constantly. The policy to criminalize it has not only failed miserably, but we have had an increase in people who are using and dying of overdose. So, like, whatever effect you think the needle exchange is going to have on potentially making drugs worse, we were already making it worse with whatever strategies we were using. We could literally not make things worse than they already were, and we already
Well,
have
yeah.
seen that this doesn't make it worse, it makes it better.
Right. And not only not only is not having a program like this making it worse, it's making it worse and then some. So not only is it going, okay, so we're finding that like a needle exchange program is actively reducing use and actively helping people get off of drugs. But without this program, not only are people using and are people committing crimes and people are overdosing, but people are getting hepatitis C and not recovering from
Right.
it. And it's putting an additional burden on our current healthcare system, which is not very good to begin with. So what's happening is we are already struggling to keep up with the healthcare needs of Americans in the United States for a lot of different reasons. Now we have said here there is a program that can actually ease some of the burden on the healthcare system by reducing rates of HIV/AIDS, by reducing hepatitis, by reducing bloodborne pathogens that come through needle sharing and all stuff that can reduce overdoses. We've said, hey, we can reduce at least some burden on this healthcare system, and everybody's going, no,
Yeah.
because it's enabling, which is like this is actively doing the opposite of what people think it's doing. It's wild to me that people
Right.
can't see that. It's wild, but I mean, we do live in a world where people think the planet is flat, so I guess that's a thing.
Yeah. There's a threshold of ignorance that's hard to overcome. Um,
Yeah, the fact that flat earthers think that the Earth is flat, but the other planets in the solar system are round, is just the leaps of logic to get there. It just I wish that I were that athletic.
I think that they think that there aren't other planets in the solar system.
There are
Um,
some.
oh, okay. Because I think
Yeah.
I think my understanding was that we believe we live in like a giant cage of some sort. Giant's not even the word for it. It would be colossally massive in a way that
Yeah.
is unable to be built by the resources that exist on the entire planet. But let's assuming that something like that could possibly exist. I'm like, so what's outside of that, you think?
Well, they think that space is water too. I've heard that too. So
Oh, well,
it's just a lot. There's just it just anyway.
okay. Well, that's pretty insane. All right. We weren't talking about flat Earth though. We were talking about drugs. But since we talked about flat Earth, we may as well let the ignorance reign and pivot to ads.
Oh, yes. Thank you for giving me that break. I needed that break more than I think anybody else did.
That's fair. Yeah, there's so much to say on this. And again, I just think it's so dumb. The whole idea that like it's enabling. I'm like, you think about that for just 2 seconds. I'm like, nobody here is choosing to use drugs just because they're now more available. And there's not, we're not even
Right.
making drugs available. We're just making the equipment more sterile. Like that's it.
That's
And
it.
like none of you are making that choice because that's not how that works. So that doesn't make any sense. So I think we've got through that. We're going to set it aside. I think some people will point to Oregon and say, aha, harm reduction failed because of what happened in Oregon. So let's talk about what went wrong in Oregon.
Yes. So in 2020, I don't know if y'all remember that year. We've lived several lifetimes since then. There's a lot going wrong. And I think this is probably not the time to do this, but they voted to decriminalize all drugs
Right.
in Oregon. And that was a big move. People were really floored by that. And people really had a hard time with that. But they voted to decriminalize all drugs in Oregon in 2020.
Now, there were supposed to be a lot of aspects of about this whole decriminalization procedure, and some of them were enacted. But point being, that was essentially how it went. But there's a couple of caveats here. One is that just decriminalizing is not harm reduction. As a matter of fact, in all of our discussion, at no point did we say decriminalizing drugs is a feature of harm reduction. I think it could be. I think you could, as a piece of this, say, let's make this not a crime and address it in the ways that we're going to address it. But just decriminalization by itself is not harm reduction. So you can't point to that and say, look, harm reduction failed, because first of all, we have a mountain of evidence, several mountains of evidence, several planets of evidence at this point showing that
Sure.
it works. But this also isn't harm reduction, so it didn't fail.
Yeah, several planets of evidence at this point in time. Um, the part of the problem too is that this went into effect immediately without an infrastructure. So all of the key characteristics that we've talked about with harm reduction, the needle exchange programs, the education programs, the welfare, the psychological health, all that stuff did not exist in the way that it needed to in a place where everything was decriminalized. So you've
Right.
got basically this context, which is drugs are not criminal anymore, but you have no supports to protect you for those of you who are using. And
Right.
that is rife for problems.
Also, like possibly the worst possible year for mental health, 2020. where
Right.
people have been in lockdown, they're bored, they're desperate. Many of them are running out of money. They're like been living off of sick days and paid vacation time. Businesses are like fighting to try and stay open, and many of them are closing. People are like inflation is already starting to take a foothold. Like there was just a massive bad year for that sort of thing to take place.
Yeah.
Motivation was high, so that was the other context that was going on. It also it didn't address any of the systematic issues that led to drug use in the first place, such as like things like poverty, like transient or homelessness, like any of the other harm reduction strategies that we would specifically recommend, like safe spaces and needle exchange. And then the other thing that happened is a huge surge in access to and fentanyl laced drugs made it in. And so, like, there was a huge uptick in the amount of fentanyl that was being found, which led to overdose deaths. There was like a massively I honestly think it's probably worth a whole episode or maybe a mini episode on unpacking what happened in Oregon, because I think people are gonna want to point to that and say, look, harm reduction failed. And the thing is, like, I'm like, well, that wasn't harm reduction, so hard to
Right.
say that it failed. But
Right.
like, also there were
It
many issues that went on.
I think you make the argument that it failed because there was no harm reduction in place.
Oh yeah, good point. Yeah. And so anyway, the for those of you who aren't aware, as we said, basically it was decriminalized, and now the state is recriminalizing drugs. So they're rolling back their policies on this to try and address the massive spike in overdose deaths that started
Right.
happening.
Right.
I think that's what where that story is, in case people weren't all caught up on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, one example is not I mean, one anecdote is not a scientific example, right? Like, I think that's another thing
Right.
too, is like
Yeah.
Oregon's its own thing. Okay.
Oregon
Like,
is its own thing. That is true.
so, but I think it's just important to know that, a lot of the sound bites that, and especially for people who don't critically think about these types of things, will point to Oregon and say, this is why it doesn't work. When the truth is it probably would have been much better had harm reduction been there when they rolled this out. And that's a simple fact. Like, I mean, like, if
Yeah.
you're going to decriminalize anything, then having a harm reduction program in place to replace like, because basically the intervention up until this point was arrest them. And
Right.
now you've gone, hey, let's do no interventions for this.
Right.
And then you go, and instead of going, let's do no interventions, they should have gone, hey, arresting people didn't work. Let's put harm reduction in instead and just switch out the interventions. They should have switched the interventions instead of just removing all interventions. And that's the problem.
Yeah, I agree. So maybe we don't need a mini now. Maybe we've covered it.
There
But
we
it
go. We
was an
did it.
interesting, yeah, it was an interesting little experiment that they did. And I think there was a lot to be learned from that. But I think the wrong lesson is that decriminalization doesn't work. I think the right
Right.
lesson is the way they went about it didn't work very well. And there was like a poor context that sort of set them up for failure, even if it would have had a more successful rollout in a different sort of time in history,
Right.
including honestly now. But who knows? But anyway, so that's Oregon. I think I'm sort of eager, I think, to sort of give my final thoughts on this, and one of them is that when we've been very clear about some of our biases on this episode, and I think one of mine, I come from a very humanist angle, and a lot of my philosophy is like, how many lives is worth it for us to put in policies like this? Like, if it saved X number of lives, then it was worth it to put this policy in. And in my mind, one. If you have saved
Yep.
one person's life, then it was worth it. And the beauty of this is it saves a lot more than one. And I mean, and you can
Right.
take this like net savings of one, right? Like, because these policies may be more people on this side, but fewer people on this side, whatever. I don't care. If you saved one life, then it was worth it. And these do a lot more than that. These have been saving thousands and thousands of people's lives. And so I think if we take at the outset that the goal here is saving lives, this is a tremendous success. It has been, it will continue to be as we get better at it. But I think that's one, I think, important piece here is the value of human life is such that anything that we do that saves them is worth doing.
Yeah. I honestly, I don't have another take home point beyond that. I mean, I think our science shows that this is the most compassionate way to help people. I think that we've demonstrated its effectiveness. I don't know what more we can do except for scream it from the mountaintops that this fucking works. And it's absurd that we have to make such an argument for something that we have demonstrated time and time and time again that works for helping people. The fact that we have to make an argument for helping people is just categorically absurd. But that's where
Yeah.
we're at right now. Like we have to make that argument, and harm reduction is just such a great way to help alleviate so many of the problems that are faced by folks that struggle with addiction, by communities that are ravaged by addiction. It's just the way to go, I think.
Yeah. I do have a couple more things to say, if
Go
that's
for it.
okay. All right. So
Please do.
one of the things here is sort of the other aspect about this is a win-win. This is a win-win-win-win-win-win-win. Everybody wins in this
Yeah, everybody
situation.
wins.
Everybody wins. The people who don't like spending money, they spend less money, a lot less money, actually. So it saves
Yeah,
money for government programs. The people who don't want people to die, that is a win. For people who don't like drugs to be around all the time, that's a win. For people who don't like ongoing homelessness crisis, it's a win. Like, the people who are addicted to drugs win. The people who are medical professionals who are trying to help people win. The society at large wins. Everybody wins here. Maybe the only people who don't win are like drug cartels potentially, and like that's a win for the rest of us. So like
right,
again, this is a win-win-win-win-win-win situation. Everybody gets to win. Like it works across the board. It is successful everywhere you put it. So it's like there's just no downside really on
right,
this. Like it does cost an upfront investment, but like that's offset by the amount of cost that is saved down the road by not investing in the infrastructure just to prevent these issues from happening in the first place or to mitigate the fallout from them happening once they do.
right. Yeah,
The one
100%.
the one other sort of take home point I have about this that I think is important, and I don't know if this qualifies as a take home point because I don't think that I made this inside of this discussion here, is that one of the issues around this and where I think people point to this and say, why do we still have an issue with overdoses if this is such a successful program? Well, the issue is that this has barely been rolled out. There is a tremendous issue of access to these services. Like the first safe drug use space in the United States as a whole, I was reading about this, I think went up in New York in like 2018, maybe. Like it was
Right,
brand new. Like we have not invested in this country, not really. We have done the methadone clinics, those worked. We've done needle exchange programs, those worked incredibly well. And like there's not widespread access to this things. So people aren't going to use it if it's literally not available to them. And people
right.
do use it when it is. So I think one of the issues we need to address here with us pointing that this has not been able to, like, people I think will point to this and say, why are we're having this huge increase in overdose deaths? We started this episode by talking about that, even though
Right.
we've had harm reduction strategies in since the 80s. And the reason that we're still having this is because the access to these is so tremendously limited that like we're not investing in really building out the infrastructure for this. And in the meantime, our population is growing and more people are finding these drugs.
Right.
And so like this is not the problem with these programs. The problem is that people aren't putting in the programs. Like a seatbelt doesn't do you any good if you don't wear it.
Right.
If I
Exactly.
were to sell you a car without seatbelts in it, like it doesn't matter how safe you want to be, like that has now become a very dangerous vehicle, right? So that I think is when people point to say like, why are we having such an issue with overdose deaths if we have these programs? And it's like because we barely have these programs. We almost don't. Like functionally, we don't. The amount of people that they help, a handful, and it's great. I'm so happy that those people were able to get help. But
Right.
like it is a tiny fraction of the number of people who are using on a daily basis.
Yep. Absolutely. 100%.
Okay, great. All right. So I think ran so long on this, and it's because we were so passionate. But I think it was so important to cover this and help understand. I think both break down the totally misconstrued and misunderstood logic that people are trying to use by calling this enabling. And I'm like, that doesn't make any sense. Like again, by that logic, you would be using heroin right now if I handed you a clean needle full of heroin.
Yeah,
And
no
like,
thanks.
yeah, pretty much no one's going to take me up on that I know at least. So anyway, I think we've addressed that sufficiently. Let's go ahead and wrap this up. Before we do, we always like to give some very fun recommendations. And before I get to recommendations, I get to do my acknowledgments and credits. If you'd like to support the show, if you'd like to reach out to us and tell us anything that we got right or wrong in this discussion, please email us directly at info@wwd.podcast.com. You can also learn more about harm reduction by going to the National Harm Reduction Coalition at harmreduction.org, where they've got more resources. Thank you for putting that in the notes here, Shane.
For sure.
If you otherwise, you can support us. You can join us on Patreon. If you do, you get access to behind the scenes content. We had some graphs and like pictures of a safe use space in this, so you could get access to our notes. We also have early release episodes, ad-free episodes, all kinds of bonus goodies you could get if you join us. Join us over on Patreon if you like access to those. And the wonderful group of people who've already made that jump includes Mike M, Megan, Layla, Mike T, Justin, Kim, Joshua, Brad, Stephanie, Olivia, Brian, Ashley, Kiara, Christy, and Michelle. Thank you all so much.
Love y'all. Y'all are the best.
If you don't want to support us over there, you could always pick up some merch. You can leave us a rating and review. You can share this episode with a friend. Just subscribe if you haven't already. Just do the things. Share us. Let people know. That definitely helps a lot. In addition, I would like to thank my team of people without whom I could not do this show, because although I am a small and powerful army of one, I still am not powerful enough to make this podcast happen. And so that includes writing and fact checking from Shane and myself. Thank you so much for recording with me today, Shane.
Of course, always.
Our social media coordinator is Emma Wilson, and the guy in the chair who makes all of the editing of these incredibly long episodes sound like normal people talking without all the mistakes that we make is Justin Greenhouse, who does just a wonderful job. So thank you, Justin.
Dustin Greenhouse.
That's right. So I think that is all that I have. Anything else that I forgot or that you would like to add before we get to our recommendations?
No, take care of each other,
Indeed. All right, let's recommend some things.
All right.
Actually, we have the time. Maybe we'll do ads first.
Oh no.
Okay, now we'll do recommendations. I'm gonna keep this kind of short because we've gone so incredibly long. So I'm recommending a movie. It came out a year or two ago, I think maybe last year. It was directed by Elizabeth Banks. I believe this is her directorial debut, but I didn't actually check that. Doesn't matter. It's called Cocaine Bear. I'm pretty sure this is rated R,
Yeah.
just by the title alone. But anyway, there's definitely gore and illicit drug use and a lot of explicit language, if you will. And it's based on a true story, although fairly loosely, if you know the true story. But yeah, fun, short little movie about a bear who finds a bunch of cocaine and does it, and the fallout from a bear doing a bunch of cocaine. So it's a ridiculous, fun, over the top, gory movie. Pretty enjoyable. It's streaming on Amazon Prime right now, but I'm sure people can get it other places. But yeah, Cocaine Bear was a lot of fun.
It looks like a wild time. I haven't seen it yet, but it's been on my watch list. I wanna see it so badly.
It's a good one. It's pretty quick too. I think it's like an hour and a half or so.
Okay, good. So my recommendation is a book. And I just finished it recently, and I do absolutely adore this author. But I think he gets a little bit of a bad rap. And so that book is called Hollywood by Charles Bukowski. I think he gets a bad rap because he's kind of known as being like a little bit of an alcoholic and a little bit of a womanizer and not very great. And some of his language is a little bit dated and stuff like that. And that's fair. But I would also say that a lot of authors have very dated language, and so I think that's really important to remember that as you're kind of reading older authors. But I will say this more than anything. Charles Bukowski is kind of known for being a certain type of author. Hollywood doesn't read like that. I think Hollywood does a good job of kind of showcasing that he was always a great author, even though his subjects and maybe the way he wrote about stuff was probably not always savory. Hollywood is about him aging in Hollywood. He writes his first screenplay, and he's working inside of the Hollywood kind of machine, trying to get this thing to work, and how ridiculous it is, and how he's kind of aging and kind of settling into a comfortable life, and how he still doesn't really like people, but at least he's nicer about it.
Okay.
And so I think it's a really fascinating read, and kind of the overall bibliography that is Charles Bukowski's work. You know, his
Hmm.
poems are a certain way. It's a novel. It's not a book of poetry. He's got a couple novels that are out. But I think it's a fascinating kind of look at like kind of end of career Bukowski and how much he's calmed down and gotten a little bit nicer and a little bit less grumpy, and mostly drinks wine instead of whiskey and vodka anymore.
Cool.
Yeah.
All right, cool. Well, this, as I said, this one went pretty long. Thank you so much for listening. If you've stuck with us through this entire thing, we really appreciate you. Join us next time. We're going to continue on this discussion about addiction and various topics inside of addiction. So we'll be around for at least a few more episodes on this. We're not really calling them
Yep.
parts; they're really intended to stand alone. But we just wanted to stay on this topic for a little bit. We've never done anything
Yeah.
quite like this before, but I'm excited. It's been fun so far.
Yeah, it's been really informative, I think. So, and I think, and we hope that it's informative for y'all as well.
Okay, and I think with that, don't have anything else, so I'm gonna say our goodbyes. This is Abraham.
This is Shane.
We're out.
See ya.
Cool. Did I forget anything?
No, I think we covered it.
Cool. Oh my God,
That
hour
went
and a
so long.
half. Justin texted me. He's like, "Wow, you guys have been doing really long episodes lately." I was like, "I know, we went
Sorry.
hard."
Yeah, sorry, Justin.
uh,
We'll come back with like a real short one.
I know, I know. I'm gonna start releasing minis starting tomorrow.
Hell
Um,
yeah.
Justin actually emailed me. He had a question about the lottery one, and we said something that he was confused by, and I want to go back and revisit that. So we might have to do a quick fix on that one, but I'll figure that out later. I'm not gonna worry about it right now.
Okay.
But in the meantime, we have plenty of episodes to release, and that would be a really quick fix anyway. So
Okay. That sounds good to me. Oh wait, what's going on here? Um I almost exported this into another file and I would have lost it forever.
oh, that would have
Um
been so sad.
that would have been so sad. I don't want to do that. Okay, so yeah, just let me know what we got to do for that if we need to fix anything or anything like that. So
Cool.
I'm up to help.
All right. Yeah, it'd be hopefully fairly pretty easy, straightforward. So
Cool.
I need to make sure I do some things. Um, recording, separate files for each person. Okay, cool. So make sure I have that enabled. Okay. All right. Well, let's stop our recording for patrons. Bye, patrons.
Bye, patrons.